Naomi Ruiz kept a bent multitool clipped to her belt that hadn't worked properly in 6 years. The pliers didn't quite close. The screwdriver head had been filed down by hand so many times it barely fit anything anymore. Everyone on Kesa Anka assumed it was sentimental junk, a habit, the kind of thing older mechanics carried out of superstition. Nobody asked her why she still carried it. If they had, she wouldn't have told them. Not yet. Kesa Anka was not a beautiful station. It orbited a red giant on its last few million years of life, a bloated dying star that painted every window on the station the color of a healing bruise. The station existed for one reason: a transit gate, an old ring of alloy and field generators that let ships cross a stretch of debris-choked space in seconds instead of months. Without the gate, 3 border systems would be cut off from everyone else. With it, Kesa Anka mattered more than its size or its comfort ever suggested. The Thuld Concordat ran the gate, and had run it for 11 years, ever since the treaty that gave them administrative rights over the corridor. The Thuld were tall, grey-skinned, for-jointed in the arms, and organized their entire society around rank, protocol, and precision. They did not raise their voices. They did not improvise. Improvisation, in Thuld doctrine, was simply a polite word for a mistake that hadn't happened yet. Human crews worked the lower decks under contract. Maintenance, cargo, life support, the unglamorous plumbing that kept a station alive. It was steady work, if not respected work. Naomi had been chief of the Human Maintenance Division for 4 years, which mostly meant she was the one who apologized to the Thuld overseer when something broke, and the one who fixed it afterward, in that order, always in that order. Chief Ruiz. Overseer Thalis Van's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had said your name 1,000 times and never once enjoyed it. The quarterly efficiency audit begins in 9 days. I trust your division's equipment logs are in order. They will be, Naomi said. They should already be. Van did not look up from the data slate hovering at her shoulder. Compliance is not a destination you arrive at the week before inspection. Naomi had heard some version of this sentence perhaps 200 times. She had learned, the way you learn to walk on a deck with bad gravity plating, exactly how to nod at the right moment without agreeing to anything specific. Behind her, in the narrow maintenance bay that smelled like hot metal and recycled air, Desmond Okafor was elbow-deep in an air scrubber that had been condemned for parts 3 separate times and was, against all reasonable expectation, still running. Desmond had a gift for looking exactly as unbothered as the situation required, which was most of the time, all of the time. "She give you the compliance speech again?" he asked, without looking up. "Word for word." "You should record it. Save her the trouble." She'd find a new one out of spite. Down the corridor, a young Thuld engineer's apprentice stood at rigid attention outside the overseer's office, waiting to be noticed. His name was Ked Oren, and he was, by Thuld standards, an embarrassment nobody quite knew what to do with, clever in ways that didn't map cleanly onto the caste ladder he'd been assigned at birth. He watched Naomi walk past with an expression he was careful to keep unreadable. Most Thuld his age didn't look at human workers at all. He always did, just for a second, like he was cataloguing something he wasn't allowed to say out loud yet. Naomi didn't think much of it that day. There was no reason to. It was, by every measure that mattered, an ordinary shift on an ordinary station, tucked against a dying star that had been dying for longer than any species currently alive had existed. Naomi's division numbered 19 people, counting herself. Most had come to Kesa Anka the way people came to any border corridor station, because the pay was steady, the work was real, and nobody back home had a better offer waiting. A few had grown up on colonies with thinner supply lines than this one, where a broken part wasn't something you requisitioned, it was something you understood, the way you understood a person you'd lived beside your whole life. Naomi had grown up on one of those colonies. She still remembered the particular quiet satisfaction of watching something everyone else had given up on start running again. She'd learned early that the Thuld didn't share that satisfaction, not because they lacked skill, but because their entire civilization had been built on the opposite assumption. The Concordat's home systems were resource-rich, their industry old and deep and thoroughly standardized. A Thuld engineer trained from childhood to expect that the correct part, built to the correct specification, would eventually arrive, and that patience and protocol was simply what you exercised in the meantime. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't even arrogance, not really, not underneath. It was a species that had simply never needed to learn what Naomi's father had taught her before she was 10 years old, that a working solution and a correct solution were not always the same thing, and that in an emergency, only one of them actually mattered. That gap in experience didn't show up often. Kessa Anka ran well enough, most cycles, that the difference between Thole doctrine and human improvisation stayed a quiet undercurrent instead of an open argument. Naomi's crew fixing things a little faster and a little cheaper than protocol technically allowed, filing the paperwork in whatever language kept everyone comfortable, and the station humming along none the wiser. It was, in its own tired way, a functioning arrangement. Nobody loved it. Nobody had bothered, in 4 years, to ask whether it could be better. After the compliance conversation, Naomi walked the ring corridor back toward the maintenance bay, past viewports that framed the red giant in long, slow arcs as the station rotated. The star's outer atmosphere billowed at the edges the way a dying ember does just before it goes fully dark, beautiful in a way that made you forget, if you let it, that you were living inside the blast radius of something enormous and slowly unraveling. She'd stopped really seeing it years ago, the way you stop seeing any view you pass every day. That morning, for no reason she could name, she looked a little longer than usual. Desmond had the scrubber panel half off by the time she reached the bay, muttering the specific low, patient profanity he reserved for machines that were almost, but not quite, cooperating. "You're going to talk that thing into working through sheer irritation one of these days," Naomi said. "Work's on you," Desmond said, not looking up. "I've never once been fixed by irritation." "You're standing here, aren't you?" He finally glanced back at her, grinning just enough to take the edge off. 9 days to audit. She give you the full speech or the abbreviated one? Full. With the destination metaphor. Ah. The good one. He wiped his hands on a rag that had long since stopped being anything close to clean. You know she's not wrong, technically. Compliance isn't a destination. No, Naomi agreed. It's a box she checks so nobody upstairs has to think about us for another quarter. Down toward the far end of the bay, a new parts requisition slate blinked on the wall terminal. Routine, low priority, the kind of thing that would sit for an hour before anyone bothered walking it down. Neither of them paid it any attention. There was no reason to. The gate ring, 5 decks up and half a kilometer out along the docking spine, hummed along exactly as it had for 11 quiet years, its containment field a steady unbroken blue that nobody on the station had ever seen do anything else. 9 days until the audit. Nobody on Kessa Anka knew they had far less time than that. It started small, the way real emergencies always do, buried under a dozen readings that looked almost normal. At 0340 station time, a monitoring buoy near the gate's outer ring recorded a flicker in the containment field, 0.5%, gone in under a second. The system logged it as noise and moved on.
No alarm sounded.
No one was woken up. It happened again at 0512. Then again at 0519, twice in quick succession, each flicker a hair larger than the last. By the time the automated systems decided the pattern was worth flagging for a live engineer, the red giant overhead had already begun venting a slow, invisible pulse of charged plasma into the debris field around the gate, the kind of stellar hiccup that happened once every few decades, harmless to anything that wasn't standing directly in the gate's resonance frequency. Kessa Anka's gate was standing directly in it. Nobody knew that yet. For now, it was still an ordinary morning, and the only sound in the maintenance bay was Desmond swearing quietly at a scrubber valve that refused to seat properly, and Naomi's bent multitool, clipped uselessly at her hip, waiting for a job it hadn't had in 6 years. The first crack. The alert came during third shift, a soft chime that most people on the station would have slept through if the station AI hadn't escalated it twice in 90 seconds. Naomi was in the mess hall, halfway through a bowl of something that was technically stew, when her wrist unit buzzed hard enough to knock her fork against the bowl. Gate field deviation, Sector 4. Non-critical. Investigate. Non-critical meant somebody would look at it eventually. Naomi had spent enough years around gate hardware to know that non-critical and fine were not the same word. She found Van already in the control ring above the gate deck, backlit by the enormous curved window that looked out on the ring itself, 500 meters of pale alloy suspended in the dark, threaded through with faint blue containment light. From here you could just see the red giant's swollen edge in the corner of the glass, close enough that on a bad day it looked like it was watching you. Overseer. Naomi kept her tone level. I saw the deviation alert. A minor fluctuation, Van said, without turning. The gate's containment field self-corrected within acceptable parameters twice already this cycle. Standard stellar interference. Nothing requiring your division. How big was the fluctuation? Van's silence lasted a beat too long. 0.5%. Then point 7. The trend is being monitored. Naomi looked past her, at the readout hovering over the command table. The pattern wasn't a flat line with noise in it. It was a slope. A small one, but a real one, climbing. That's not noise, she said. That's a resonance building. If the star's putting out charged plasma at a frequency close to the Gates field harmonics, every pulse is going to push the deviation a little further before the field corrects. It's not going to hold that pattern forever. Van finally turned to face her, and there was something in her expression that Naomi had learned, over 4 years, to recognize as the specific Thold flavor of polite dismissal. Chief Ruiz, Gate Field Dynamics fall under Concordat Engineering Authority. Your division maintains the human crewed subsystems. I appreciate your concern. I'm not asking to run it. I'm asking you to look at the slope. I have looked at the slope. Van's voice didn't rise. It never rose. It is within the tolerance our own engineers designed for. We built this gate. We understand its behavior far better than a maintenance contractor possibly could. There it was, laid out plain as a diagram, the whole architecture of how this station worked. Naomi had a decade of hands-on field experience with 3 different generations of gate hardware, half of it salvaged, half of it improvised, none of it Thold issued. None of that counted here. What counted was who had built the thing, and who was licensed to speak about it. Understood, Naomi said, because there was nothing else productive to say, and went back to the mess hall to finish a bowl of cold stew. The deviation kept climbing. Slowly, in fits, self-correcting each time back toward baseline, but never quite as far back as it had started. Like a rope fraying one strand at a time. 2 days later, the fluctuation caused something concrete. A life support relay in the lower human quarters lost sync with the station's main power regulation, tripped by a harmonic bleed nobody had planned for. Scrubber output dropped. Oxygen mix in 3 corridors drifted out of spec, not dangerously, not yet, but enough that people started getting headaches, enough that a Thold technician named Iron Vosk was sent down to fix it by the book. Iron Vosk spent 4 hours running the approved diagnostic sequence, replacing 2 components that tested within spec, and ultimately filed a report stating the relay required a matched replacement part that would arrive with the supply ship in 11 days. 11 days. The corridors would be breathing thin air for 11 days. Naomi found Desmond in the relay closet 20 minutes after Iron Vosk left, staring at the offending unit with the particular expression he wore when a problem had personally offended him. He replaced the regulator and the coupling, Desmond said. Both fine. The actual fault's in the sync timing, not the hardware. It's not broken. It's just talking a different language than the rest of the grid now, since the field bleed shifted its clock. Can you fix it? Not with anything Van's willing to sign off on. Desmond crouched, running a hand along a tangle of old cable bundled into the relay's housing. Cable that had clearly not been there when the unit was installed, cable that had been added, patched, repatched, over years of small human fixes nobody upstairs had ever bothered to audit. But I've got a timing chip out of a decommissioned cargo drone in the salvage bin that runs close enough to the old clock rate. If I splice it in as a buffer, translate the signal before it hits the regulator instead of trying to match the regulator to the new timing. That's not an approved part. No, Desmond agreed. It's a working part. Naomi looked at the relay for a long moment. Then she looked at her wrist unit, at the still climbing deviation graph she'd pulled up out of habit, the one nobody upstairs seemed to be worried about yet. Do it quiet, she said. Log it as a diagnostic reset. If anyone asks, we ran the standard sequence twice. Desmond nodded and got to work, and Naomi stayed a while longer than she strictly needed to, watching him strip the drone's timing chip down to its bare housing with the unhurried patience of a man who had done this exact kind of translation 100 times on 100 different pieces of equipment that were never meant to speak to each other. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of thing anyone upstairs would ever see, let alone credit. But there was a particular kind of quiet pride in it that Naomi had never quite been able to explain to anyone who hadn't grown up needing it. The specific satisfaction of listening to a system, understanding what it actually needed instead of what its specification sheet said it needed, and giving it that instead. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was the oldest rule in maintenance work. Fix the thing in front of you with what you actually have, and worry about the paperwork after everyone can breathe properly. The splice took 40 minutes. The corridor's air mix stabilized within the hour. Nobody upstairs noticed, because nobody upstairs was looking at the human quarters unless something forced them to. Ked Oren noticed. He'd been sent down with a parts requisition that turned out to be unnecessary, and he stood in the relay closet doorway a moment too long, watching Desmond seal the housing back up, watching the readout settle into a clean, boring, stable line. "That part," he said carefully, "is not rated for this system." Desmond didn't even turn around. "No, it isn't." "Then how is it working?" "Because I told it what it needed to do instead of what it was built to do," Desmond said. "Parts don't care what their paperwork says. They care what they're asked to do." Ked Oren didn't answer right away. He crouched instead, uninvited, and studied the sealed housing with the same careful attention he gave every piece of certified Thole hardware, as if the relay might reveal something different about itself now that he knew what was hiding inside it. "How did you know it would accept a different timing signal at all?" he asked finally. "The specification does not describe any tolerance for substitution." "The spec describes what the part's supposed to do when everything around it is working," Desmond said. "It doesn't describe what it can be talked into doing when everything around it isn't. Those are different documents. Nobody writes the second one down, because nobody wants to admit it exists." "On Kessa Prime," Ked Oren said slowly, "we are taught that deviation from specification is the first symptom of systemic failure. That small unauthorized changes accumulate until a system can no longer be trusted." "Maybe," Desmond said. "Or maybe a system that can only be trusted when nothing ever goes wrong with it wasn't built to survive the day something finally does." Ked Oren had no answer prepared for that either. He stood there a moment longer, watching the readouts settle into their clean, boring, stable line, filed the requisition as fulfilled, said nothing to Van about the timing chip, and walked back up toward the control ring, turning something over in his mind that he did not yet have words for. It wasn't in any manual he'd been trained on. It should have bothered him more than it did. The deviation graph kept climbing, one small fraction at a time, and nobody with the authority to worry about it was worried yet. What the book says. By the 5th day, the gate's containment field was fluctuating by nearly 4% on its worst pulses, and even Thole protocol, which required 3 independent confirmations before anyone was permitted to call something a crisis, could no longer avoid the word. Van called an emergency briefing in the control ring. Every senior Thole engineer attended, standing in the precise, evenly spaced arrangement Thole used instinctively for any formal gathering. Naomi and Desmond were present as required contractors, standing slightly apart, the way they always were. "The stellar plasma venting event has proven more sustained than historical records indicated," said Chief Engineer Solon Kett, the station's senior Thole technical authority, a broad-shouldered man whose voice carried the particular confidence of someone who had never personally watched a system fail. "The gate's containment field is resonating with the star's output frequency. Left unaddressed, resonance amplitude will continue increasing until containment fails entirely." "Define entirely," Desmond said. Solon Kett did not appreciate being interrupted by a contractor, but answered anyway, because the answer was simple and terrible. Catastrophic field collapse. The gate ring will lose structural cohesion. Anything within 400 meters, including this station, will not survive the discharge. The room absorbed that in silence. "The solution," Solon Kett continued, "is a standard resonance dampening procedure. We recalibrate the containment field's harmonic signature to a frequency offset from the star's output, using the gate's own emitters. This is documented Concordat protocol, tested and verified across 61 prior installations. Implementation begins in 4 hours." Naomi studied the schematic hovering above the table. It was a clean solution, on paper. It assumed the gate's emitters were all functioning within their original design tolerances. It assumed the field generators hadn't drifted from years of small local patches, small local fixes, small local compromises made by a maintenance crew doing its best with contractor-grade parts under a supply chain that ran 11 days behind schedule. "Has anyone cross-checked the emitter calibration against current baseline?" she asked. "Not design spec. Current baseline. There's drift in at least 6 of the secondary emitters. I've flagged it in 3 maintenance reports over the last 2 years." Solon Kett's expression made it clear exactly how much weight those reports had carried. The emitters are inspected annually and certified with intolerance. "Annually," Naomi said. "It's been 11 months since the last inspection, and the star's been dumping charged plasma into the field for 5 days straight. Tolerance moves." "Chief Ruiz," Van said, in the tone she used to end conversations rather than continue them, "the protocol accounts for standard operational variance. Your concerns are noted." "Noted," Naomi had come to understand that word as a small, polite coffin that ideas were placed into and never taken back out of. The recalibration began 4 hours later, exactly as scheduled. Every Thold engineer on the station gathered in the control ring to watch, and for the first 20 minutes, it worked beautifully. The deviation graph, which had been climbing steadily for 5 days, began to flatten. Somebody actually applauded, quietly, the restrained Thold version of celebration, a slow double tap of one hand against the opposite forearm. Naomi watched the secondary emitter readings instead of the main deviation graph. 6 of them were drawing more power than the recalibration model predicted, compensating for a drift the model didn't know existed. The numbers were small. They were also, unmistakably, climbing. "Something's wrong," she said quietly, to Desmond, not to the room. "Main graph looks fine," Desmond murmured back. "Main graph's an average. Look at the secondaries." For a while, the numbers held. Naomi found herself almost hoping she was wrong, which was a strange thing to hope for, and also the only honest thing to hope for in a room full of people whose lives depended on a fix she didn't trust. "Deviation at 1.1% and falling," Solon Kett reported, and there was real relief in his voice, the particular relief of a man watching a career's worth of training prove itself correct in front of an audience. Recalibration proceeding within expected parameters. Van allowed herself something close to a smile, small and controlled, the kind of expression that on a human face might have meant nothing at all and on a Thold face meant a great deal. "Excellent work, Chief Engineer." Naomi kept her eyes on the secondary emitter panel, where 6 small numbers sat in a column nobody else in the room was looking at. Emitter 6 was drawing 4% more power than its baseline. Emitter 7, coupled to it through the same compensating relay, was drawing 6% more. Neither number was alarming on its own. Together, climbing in lockstep, they described a shape Naomi had seen before, on smaller systems, in smaller emergencies, always in the last few minutes before something gave. "Desmond," she said quietly. "I see it." "Overseer." Naomi kept her voice level, the way she'd learned to over 4 years, pitched for information rather than alarm. "Secondary emitters 6 and 7 are drawing compensatory load well above baseline. If that trend continues at its current rate, they'll hit thermal limits inside 10 minutes. The recalibration model accounts for compensatory load across the full emitter array," Solon Kett said, not quite looking at her, his attention fixed on the primary deviation graph, which continued its steady, reassuring slide toward 0. "Localized variance within 2 adjacent emitters is expected and self-limiting. It's not self-limiting if the drift causing it isn't in the model to begin with." "Chief Ruiz." Van's voice carried a warning now, not unkind exactly, but final. "The procedure is working. The graph is in front of you." Naomi looked at the graph. It was, undeniably, a beautiful downward curve, exactly the shape 61 prior installations had trained everyone in this room to expect. She looked at the 6 small numbers nobody else was watching, still climbing, and understood with a cold, familiar certainty that the room was about to learn the difference between an average and a warning. 26 minutes into the recalibration, emitter 6 overloaded. It happened fast, faster than the room's collective confidence could adjust to. A power spike cascaded backward through the coupling that fed emitters 6 and 7, which had been drawing compensatory load for a drift nobody official had logged. Emitter 7 overloaded 4 seconds later. The gate's containment field, instead of settling into the calm offset frequency the protocol promised, lurched violently, and for one instant the deviation graph didn't just fail to flatten, it spiked to nearly 9%, more than double anything the station had recorded before the fix began. Alarms filled the control ring. Solon Kett's calm evaporated in real time as he issued a shutdown command that took the recalibration system for agonizing seconds to obey. When it finally did, the deviation graph settled, not back to where it had started, but higher, at just over 5%, with 2 emitters now offline entirely. "Emitter status," Van said, and for the first time in 4 years, Naomi heard something in her voice that wasn't flat. 6 and 7 are non-responsive, Solon Kett said. "Physical damage likely. We will need replacement components." "That aren't arriving for another 6 days, Naomi finished. Nobody corrected her. The room that had, 20 minutes earlier, applauded a fix now stood in the particular silence of people who had just watched the approved answer make things worse. Solon Kett stared at the readouts like they'd personally betrayed him. Van's data slate hung forgotten at her shoulder. Ked Oren, standing near the back where junior staff were expected to stay quiet and invisible, looked at the failed emitter readouts, then at Naomi, then back at the readouts, with the expression of someone doing math he wasn't supposed to be doing. "Overseer," Naomi said, into the silence, careful to keep her voice steady, not triumphant, because triumph would have been the wrong thing entirely and she knew it. "I'd like permission to bring my division in on this." Van didn't answer immediately. Behind her, through the great curved window, the gate's containment field flickered, visibly now, a faint stutter of blue light along 500 meters of alloy, close enough to see with the naked eye for the first time in the station's history. 4 hours, Van said finally. "You have 4 hours to propose something before I report this to Concordat Command as a Tier 1 emergency." It wasn't trust. It wasn't even close to trust. But it was the first door Naomi had been offered in 4 years, and she had no intention of letting it close. What's in the bin? The salvage bay on Kessa Anchor's lowest deck was, by any Thold engineering standard, an eyesore. It was where broken things went instead of being properly disposed of: decommissioned drone parts, obsolete field coils from 3 different manufacturers, half a dozen species worth of incompatible cabling, cracked housing units nobody had ever filed the paperwork to jettison. Van had threatened to have it cleared out twice. Both times, budget constraints had quietly saved it. Naomi loved that room the way some people loved a messy garage. Everything in it had failed at its original job and was, in her experience, usually still good at something. 6 hours to get 2 emitters back online, or close enough to compensate, Desmond said, running a scanner over a shelf of coils. With matched Thold parts that don't exist on this station. "We are not going to match them," Naomi said. "We are going to translate around them, same as the relay." Ked Oren was standing in the salvage bay doorway. He had followed Naomi down without being asked, without being sent, which was itself a small quiet rebellion nobody had officially noticed yet. "You are not authorized to be down here," he said, though he made no move to leave. "Neither are you," Naomi said. "Since you're here, make yourself useful. What do you know about emitter coupling architecture that isn't in the field manual?" He hesitated. It was, Naomi understood later, the exact moment where a very small door opened inside him, one he'd probably kept shut his whole life because nobody had ever asked him a question that assumed he might know something outside the approved curriculum. "The coupling design is derived from an older Thold standard," he said slowly, "before the Concordat unified specifications. My grandmother's generation used a different coil geometry, wider gauge, lower resonance frequency. It fell out of use because it was less efficient at standard load." "Less efficient how much?" "Perhaps 8%. "We don't need efficient," Naomi said. "We need it to not explode. Do we have anything down here built to that old geometry?" It took 40 minutes of digging through crates that hadn't been opened in years, but they found it. 4 decommissioned field coils, salvaged from a Thold cargo vessel that had been stripped for parts a decade earlier, built to the exact older specification Ked Oren had just described. Wrong generation. Wrong efficiency rating. Structurally, almost identical in the one dimension that actually mattered. "These will not integrate cleanly with current control firmware," Ked Oren said, turning one over in his hands like he still couldn't quite believe he was holding it. "Nothing in this room integrates cleanly with anything," Desmond said. "That's what I'm for." He was already pulling the drone timing chip design forward in his head, the same trick he'd used on the relay, scaled up. Translate, don't force match. Let the old coil speak its own dialect and build something in the middle that both sides could understand. Naomi unclipped the bent multitool from her belt without thinking about it, the way she always did when her hands needed something to do while her mind worked. She turned it over once, twice, the useless pliers catching the light. Ked Oren watched her do it. "That tool is broken," he said. "Why do you keep it?" Naomi almost gave him the deflection she gave everyone. Then she looked at the coils on the table, at Desmond's hands already moving, at the strange, unlikely shape of the last 6 hours, and decided the moment had earned an actual answer. "My father was a repair tech on a station a lot like this one, back on a colony world with about 1/10 the supply budget we get here," she said. "Whole colony ran on things that were 1 part broken and 2 parts good enough. He gave me this the day I told him I wanted to be a mechanic. Told me the day it stopped working completely was the day I'd finally understand what it was actually for. It does not function. It taught me that the thing you're holding doesn't have to work the way it was built to work. It just has to work." She set it back on her belt. "Everything in this room is the same lesson. We don't have matched parts. We are never going to have matched parts, not on this station, not on time. So we build the middle. Ked Oren looked at the coils, then at the tool, then, for a long moment, at nothing in particular. On Kessa Prime, he said quietly, engineers who deviate from certified specification are reassigned. Sometimes permanently. My cast record would not survive documented involvement in an unauthorized modification. Desmond didn't look up from the coil in his hands, but he spoke anyway, quieter than usual. For what it's worth, nobody in this room is asking you to betray anything you believe in. We are asking you to look at a problem with us instead of a rulebook. Those aren't the same request. Nobody's asking you to sign anything, Naomi said. You can walk out of this room right now and nobody will think less of you for it. But if this doesn't work, 6 days from now we run out of parts and options both, and there won't be a certified fix left to try. He stood in the doorway a long moment. Then he stepped fully into the room and picked up one of the coils. Show me the coupling diagram, he said. I know things about this geometry the manual does not. 3 hours and 40 minutes into their 4-hour window, they had a plan, a hybrid emitter assembly, old fold coil geometry translated through Desmond's improvised signal bridge, tuned by Ked Oren's inherited knowledge of a design his own people had officially forgotten. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't certified. It was, as far as 3 exhausted people in a salvage bay could tell, the only thing standing between Kessa Anka and a countdown nobody could stop. Naomi looked at the clock, then at Desmond, then at Ked Oren, who was still holding the coil like it might change his mind about existing. Let's go tell the overseer we've got 20 minutes to spare, she said, and a plan she is absolutely not going to like. The manifest. Van did not like it. She stood over the schematic Naomi laid out on the control ring's main table, an emitter assembly built from decommissioned parts, foreign coil geometry, and a signal translator spliced together out of drone components, and her expression cycled through several forms of disbelief before settling on something colder. This is not a certified repair, she said. This is a fabrication assembled from salvage. Yes, Naomi said. I cannot authorize an unverified, uncertified modification to primary gate hardware based on a design contributed in part by a first-year apprentice and built from parts pulled out of a scrap bin. You can authorize it, Naomi said, or you can wait 6 days for parts that won't arrive before this field collapses. Those are the 2 options on the table. I understand neither one is comfortable. Solon Ket, still visibly shaken from the recalibration failure, studied the schematic with an expression that wasn't quite hostility anymore. It had shifted into something closer to exhausted uncertainty. A man watching the ground under his professional confidence continue to move. The coil geometry, he said slowly, looking at Ked Oren. This is pre-unification design. Where did you? My grandmother's caste specialized in early gate engineering, before standardization, Ked Oren said. His voice shook slightly, but he didn't look away. It was not part of my formal training. I recognized it because family record kept the schematics, not because the Concordat taught it to me. Van's gaze moved to him, sharp and unreadable, and for a moment Naomi thought the conversation was about to end very badly for the apprentice standing in the middle of it. But whatever calculation moved behind the overseer's expression, it didn't land where Naomi expected. That information is not in any current engineering database, Van said. It wasn't quite a question.
No, Overseer.
Why not? Ked Oren didn't have a clean answer for that, and the silence that followed said more than any answer could have. Nobody in the room needed it explained to them what it meant that useful knowledge had simply been allowed to fall out of the record because the caste that held it had stopped being asked. Containment failure probability now exceeds acceptable threshold, the station AI announced, flat and evenly modulated in every language spoken aboard Kessa Anka at once. Evacuation protocol available. Estimated time to critical failure, 9 to 14 hours, dependent on stellar activity. The room went very still. We evacuate, Solon Ket said. Standard emergency protocol. Shuttle capacity is, he checked the figure and, for the first time all day, looked genuinely uneasy delivering it. Shuttle capacity is 412. Station population, including contracted crew, is 630. Naomi felt something cold settle in her chest. That's over 200 people short. Emergency protocol prioritizes evacuation by role classification, Solon Ket said, reading from the automated manifest the AI had already begun generating. Command staff, certified engineering personnel, essential administrative roles. Contracted labor and support staff are designated secondary priority, to be evacuated in a second wave if shuttle capacity allows a return trip before failure. Naomi looked at the manifest scrolling past on the display. Her name wasn't on the first wave. Neither was Desmond's. Neither, she noted with a jolt that had nothing to do with her own safety, was Ked Oren's. His caste ranking, apparently, placed him below the threshold too. There won't be a second wave, Naomi said quietly. You said it yourselves. 9 to 14 hours. A round trip to a safe distance and back is longer than that. Nobody in the room disputed it, because nobody could. Van stared at the manifest for a long moment. Whatever calculation was happening behind her eyes, it wasn't the flat administrative certainty she usually carried. For the first time in 4 years, Naomi watched her look genuinely unsure of what the correct answer was supposed to be. The manifest follows established Concordat priority protocol, Van said finally, but it came out slower than her usual pronouncements, more like she was testing the sentence for weight rather than delivering it. Then 218 people are going to die because of where they happen to sit on a list, Naomi said. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Or we can spend the next few hours finishing the fix instead of packing shuttles, and nobody has to be on any list at all. If the repair fails, Van said, everyone who remains dies instead of 218. If it works, Naomi said, everyone lives, including everyone currently ranked high enough to already have a seat. Overseer, Solanket said quietly, before Van could speak again, if I may. The recalibration failure was mine. I dismissed Chief Ruiz's concerns about emitter drift twice, formally and informally, and the failure that followed was a direct consequence of that dismissal. If there is a decision to be made about whose judgment this station trusts in the next 9 hours, I would ask that it not rest on the same assumptions that put us here. It cost him something to say it. Naomi could see that plainly enough, the particular discomfort of a man who had built his entire professional identity on certainty, now standing in front of that identity's wreckage and choosing to say so out loud instead of quietly protecting it. It was, in its own way, its own small act of the exact improvisation Naomi's crew had spent the day defending, throwing out the response the manual would have suggested, because the manual's response had already failed once today. The math was simple. The decision wasn't. Van had spent her entire career inside a system that told her, at every level, that ordered priority was how you kept catastrophe from becoming chaos, that the list existed precisely so no one had to make this choice on instinct in the middle of an emergency. She looked at Naomi. She looked at Ked Oren, standing very still, waiting to find out whether the last 6 hours had been a small act of loyalty or a career-ending mistake. She looked, finally, at the schematic still glowing on the table, cobbled together from 3 species worth of forgotten and mismatched parts. Chief Ruiz, she said, how much time do you need to complete installation? 6 hours, if Solanket's team helps us route the power coupling. Less, if he stops arguing about whether it should work and starts checking whether it does. Solanket didn't argue. Whatever pride had governed his objections that morning had been spent entirely on emitter 6 and 7. Begin evacuation of non-essential personnel who wish to leave, Van said, loud enough for the room and the AI both to register it as an order. Everyone else, we are attempting the repair. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't an apology, either, for 4 years of noted concerns filed and forgotten. But it was, Naomi understood, the overseer choosing to stand in the same uncertain ground as everyone else on the station, instead of standing safely above it on a list that would have cost 200 lives to keep intact. The middle. They had 6 hours. They used 5. The gate deck, usually a place of quiet, orderly Thold precision, became something closer to a battlefield surgery for the length of that afternoon. Desmond ran the signal translation splice personally, hands moving with the particular calm he only found under genuine pressure, muttering half sentences to himself that nobody else needed to understand. Ked Oren worked beside him, translating not just old coil geometry into working numbers but, more quietly, translating himself, a Thold engineer who had spent his whole life being told which questions he wasn't permitted to ask, now asking every question he could think of, out loud, in front of his own overseer, and not flinching when the answers came back strange. Naomi moved between the 2 failed emitter housings, hands raw from cold metal, running calibration checks against numbers that existed nowhere in any Concordat manual. Every 20 minutes the deviation graph ticked upward, a small steady reminder that the star overhead did not care how clever anyone's improvisation was. Sol and Ket, to his credit, stopped objecting somewhere around the second hour and started actually helping, running power routing calculations that needed real fold engineering expertise nobody in the salvage bay had. It was, Naomi thought, the first time she'd seen a Fold engineer treat a human mechanics plan as something worth optimizing rather than something worth correcting. Coupling resistance is drifting outside my model, Sol and Ket said, 4 hours in, staring at a readout that refused to settle where his equation said it should. This should not be possible with the geometry Ket Oren specified. It's not drifting outside your model, Naomi said, without looking up from the housing she was sealing. Your model's built for parts that match. This isn't matched parts. It's translated parts. There's always a little slop in translation. You build for the slop instead of fighting it. I do not have a framework for building around uncertainty. Then borrow ours, Desmond said. We've had 1 hour whole professional lives. Sol and Ket didn't answer immediately. He stood over the readout a long moment, and something in his posture, the particular stiffness of a man recalculating not just an equation but his understanding of what equations were for, softened, fractionally, into something more useful. He picked up a stylus and began, cautiously, sketching a tolerance band around the drifting number instead of trying to force it back to a fixed value. It was a small thing. It was also, Naomi realized, the first time in 4 years she'd watched a Fold engineer voluntarily build slack into a design instead of trying to engineer the slack out of it. The work went on in stretches that blurred together the way real emergencies always did. Not one continuous crisis, but a long chain of small, specific problems, each one solved just in time to reveal the next. A cable run that had to be rerouted around a housing bracket never designed to accommodate it. A signal timing mismatch that cost them 40 minutes before Ket Oren remembered a detail from his grandmother's schematics that resolved it in 4. A junior Fold technician, drafted in to help with power routing, who kept apologizing every time he suggested a workaround instead of a certified fix, until Desmond finally told him, not unkindly, to stop apologizing and start explaining, because half his workarounds were better than what the manual would have suggested anyway. Naomi worked the failed housings with hands that had gone past sore into a kind of practice numbness, sealing cable runs, testing continuity, unclipping and reclipping the bent multitool at her hip out of pure habit every time she needed a hand free for something else. At one point she caught Ket Oren watching her do it again, that same unreadable expression from the salvage bay, and this time he didn't ask what it was for. He just nodded, once, like a man filing away a piece of evidence he already understood the shape of. By the 4th hour, the gate deck had the particular hush of a room where everyone had stopped talking except when the work required it. Even Van, who spent most of that stretch relaying status updates to Concordat Command in a voice that gave away nothing, occasionally paused at the edge of the workspace to watch 3 species worth of forgotten and mismatched parts slowly become, against every specification anyone in the room had trained under, one working thing. By the 5th hour, the hybrid assembly was fully installed across both damaged emitter housings, drone-translated signal bridges humming quietly beside decades obsolete coil geometry, all of it held together by cable splices that would have failed any formal Concordat safety inspection and were, in that moment, the only thing standing between the station and collapse. Evacuation shuttles had launched 2 hours earlier, carrying just over 300 people who had chosen, or, in a handful of cases, been quietly instructed by department heads who didn't want the responsibility of holding them there, to leave rather than gamble on an unproven fix. Naomi didn't blame a single one of them. 328 people remained on Keserenka, essential personnel who couldn't leave the repair unattended, and a number of contracted crew, low-caste Fold staff, and support workers who had simply chosen to stay, quietly, without being asked to explain why. At the 5-hour 40-minute mark, with 20 minutes left before Van's original deadline and roughly 3 hours of margin left before the gate's own projected failure window, Naomi stood at the control ring's main table with her hand hovering over the activation control. Once this goes live, she said, there's no clean shutdown if it's wrong. It either dampens the resonance or it adds to it. We won't get a second attempt before the field collapses. I am aware, Van said. She was standing closer than she'd stood to Naomi in 4 years, close enough that Naomi could see, for the first time, that the overseer's composure was not effortless. It was work. It had always been work. For what it's worth, Naomi said, I think it holds. Your professional opinion, Van said, carries considerably more weight with me today than it did 9 days ago. It wasn't an apology. It also wasn't nothing. Naomi looked at Desmond, who nodded. She looked at Ket Oren, who was standing very straight, hands folded in front of him in the exact rigid posture Thold apprentices were trained to hold during formal proceedings, except this time it looked less like obedience and more like someone standing at attention for something he'd actually helped build. Activating hybrid dampening assembly, Naomi said, and pressed the control. For 3 full seconds, nothing on the display changed at all, and those 3 seconds were, without exception, the longest of Naomi Ruiz's life. Then the deviation graph, which had been climbing steadily for 6 days, which had spiked catastrophically once already under a fix built entirely by the book, began, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, to fall. What held? It didn't fall smoothly. Nothing about the fix had been smooth, and the results honored that. The deviation graph dropped in fits, stuttered, climbed a fraction, dropped further, the whole system settling the way a badly tuned engine settles, not gracefully, but honestly, each correction a real correction and not a projection. 6%, Solon Kett read off the display, his voice tight. 5.2. 4.8. Hold your breath a little longer, Desmond muttered, watching the translated signal bridge's output like it might change its mind if he looked away. The gate ring itself, visible through the great curved window, had been visibly flickering for the better part of 6 hours, a stutter of blue light along 500 meters of alloy that had made everyone in the control ring flinch every time it happened. As the deviation dropped past 3%, the flicker began to smooth. Past 2%, it stopped entirely, the containment field settling back into the steady, unbroken glow it had held for 11 quiet years before any of this started. 1.4%, Solon Kett said, and for the first time in his voice there was something that wasn't caution. Holding. It's holding. Nobody applauded this time. Nobody did the slow double tap of forearm against forearm. The room simply stood in the particular silence of people who had spent the last 6 hours convinced, on some level beneath conscious thought, that they might not get to stand in this room again. Ked Oren was the first to move, crossing to the readout and running an independent check against Solon Kett's numbers, hands slightly unsteady, double-checking not because he distrusted the fix but because some habits of diligence didn't disappear just because the crisis had ended. Confirmed, he said quietly. Field stability within normal operational range. Van didn't speak immediately. She stood at the window, looking out of the gate ring, steady now, glowing that familiar unbroken blue, for a long moment before she finally turned back to the room. Recall the evacuation shuttles, she said to the communications officer. All personnel, return to station. Then she looked at Naomi, and at Desmond, and at Ked Oren standing between them in a posture that no longer looked like it belonged to either side of the line that had existed on this station that morning. Chief Ruiz, Van said. The repair held. It did. It should not have, Van said, and it wasn't an accusation, just a plain statement of a fact she was still working to reconcile. By every specification this station operates under, that assembly should not function. The parts are wrong. The tolerances are wrong. The methodology is not documented anywhere in Concordat engineering doctrine. It's not wrong, Naomi said. It's just not written down yet. Van held her gaze for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, not into warmth exactly. That wasn't a language Thold formality moved in easily, but into something that had room, for the first time, for a version of competence that didn't come with matching paperwork. Ked Oren, Van said, and the apprentice straightened further, bracing for whatever consequence 4 years of Concordat culture had trained him to expect. The coil geometry you contributed was not part of your formal certification.
No, Overseer.
It should be. Van's voice was still flat, still formal, but the sentence landed differently than anything she'd said all week. I will be requesting a review of engineering curriculum standards. Knowledge that saves a station should not depend on which family happened to remember it. Ked Oren didn't have a response prepared for that. Naomi watched him not have one, watched him simply stand there absorbing a sentence that had probably rearranged something fairly fundamental about how he understood his own future on this station. Outside the window, the shuttles were already turning back, small bright specks against the vast red curve of the dying star, 300 and some people coming home to a station that, against every certified expectation, was still there to come home to. Naomi stayed in the control ring longer than she needed to, watching the gate ring's containment field hold its steady, unbroken glow, waiting for the particular exhaustion that always arrived after a crisis ended to finish climbing up through her legs. Desmond found her there, 2 cups of something that only loosely resembled coffee balanced in his hands, and passed one over without a word. You knew it'd hold, he said, not quite a question. I hoped it'd hold. There's a difference. Didn't look like hoping. Looked like knowing. Naomi wrapped both hands around the cup and watched the last of the shuttles align for final approach, their running lights small and steady against the enormous red backdrop of a star that would keep dying, slowly, for longer than anyone currently alive on the station would exist to watch. I've hoped things would hold before and been wrong, she said. This is just the first time I've been right in front of people who mattered enough to notice. Desmond huffed something that was almost a laugh. They noticed. Yeah, Naomi said. They did. Down on the gate deck below them, Ked Oren was still running independent verification checks on the hybrid assembly, long after Solanket had already confirmed the numbers twice, because some part of him clearly needed to see it hold with his own hands before he'd let himself believe it. Naomi understood that particular need better than most. She'd built her entire career on it. The second wave. The audit happened, in the end, 9 days late instead of on schedule, and it looked nothing like the audit Naomi had spent 4 years dreading. Van conducted it personally, which had never happened before. She walked the maintenance bay slowly, reading not just the compliance logs but the maintenance history behind them, the small, unauthorized patches, the field splices, the years of quiet improvisation that had, until now, been treated as a liability to be managed rather than a body of knowledge worth understanding. This relay, she said, standing in front of the same closet where Desmond had spliced a drone timing chip into a life support system 9 days earlier. The repair log shows a standard diagnostic reset. It wasn't a standard diagnostic reset, Naomi said. There didn't seem to be any point in the old habit anymore. I know, Van said. I read the actual component logs this time. She studied the closed housing for a moment longer. How many repairs on this station were logged as one thing and performed as another? Naomi thought about lying, out of pure old reflex, then didn't. More than I could count without going through years of records. Then we will go through the records, Van said. Not to discipline anyone. To document what actually works. She turned to face Naomi fully. Kessa Anchor operated for years on repairs your division made, and I refuse to formally acknowledge existed. That was not efficient administration. That was willful blindness dressed as protocol. It was, as close as Naomi had ever heard from a Thold overseer, an apology. It didn't come with an admission of fault stated outright. That wasn't a sentence Thold formality made room for, but it came with something more useful, a change in what happened next. Van established, within the month, a formal cross-division engineering review, human maintenance staff and Thold engineers working jointly, documenting improvised solutions, testing which ones deserve to become standard practice instead of quiet exceptions filed under diagnostic resets. Ked Oren was reassigned, at his own request, from general apprentice duties to the new review team, where his grandmother's forgotten coil geometry became, within 2 months, an officially documented alternate specification, credited under his family's name. Naomi kept the bent multitool clipped to her belt, still not working, still not needing to. Some tools taught their lesson once and then just got to sit there afterward, proof of something rather than a solution to it. 6 weeks after the gate stabilized, Naomi stood in the mess hall with a bowl of the same mediocre stew, and Overseer Thalas Van sat down across from her without being asked, which had never happened before either. The full quarterly report is filed, Van said. Your division's compliance rating is the highest on record. Because you finally logged what we actually do. Because what you actually do, Van said, turned out to be worth logging. She looked toward the window, where the gate's containment field glowed steady and unbroken against the dying red light of the star it orbited. I have spent 11 years believing precision meant matching everything to a known standard. I am beginning to understand that precision sometimes means knowing exactly how far you can bend one. Naomi didn't have a clever answer for that. She didn't need one. Down the corridor, Ked Oren was walking a group of junior Thold engineers through the salvage bay for the first time in the station's history as an official part of their training, gesturing at shelves of broken things with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had spent his whole life being told a room like this didn't matter. Naomi finished her stew slowly, watching the corridor traffic move past the mess hall doorway the way it always had, Thold engineers and human maintenance crew crossing paths without much comment, the ordinary rhythm of a station that had, 9 days ago, come within a handful of hours of not existing anymore. Nobody outside this station would ever know how close it had come. There would be no monument, no formal record beyond the dry language of an incident report, no galaxy-wide broadcast marking the day a dying star nearly took a relay station and 600 people with it. That was fine. Naomi had never needed the galaxy to know. She'd only ever needed the people standing in the room with her to understand what had actually held things together when it mattered. And for the first time in 4 years, they finally did. It was, on the surface, an entirely ordinary day on an unremarkable station orbiting a dying star. The same red light through the same windows. The same stew in the same bowl. But somewhere down the corridor, the hierarchy that had quietly run Kessa Anchor for 11 years had bent, just slightly, and held, the way a good repair always does, not because it matched the design, but because it was built to survive being tested. The supply ship arrived, on schedule, 11 days after the deviation had first appeared on a monitoring buoy nobody had thought worth waking anyone up over. It carried, among its cargo, the 2 matched replacement emitter components that would have fixed the original fault, had they arrived in time, exactly as specified, exactly to tolerance. Sol and Ket had them installed within the week, quietly, as a long-term replacement for the hybrid assembly that had carried the station through the crisis. Nobody treated it as a defeat. The hybrid assembly had done its job. It had never needed to be permanent to have been necessary, and Naomi had learned a long time ago that the difference between a temporary fix and a real one was mostly just how long you needed it to last. She kept the old assembly anyway, once it was pulled, and asked Sol and Ket if she could have it moved down to the salvage bay instead of sent for disposal. He didn't ask why. He simply signed the transfer order, and the housing found a shelf of its own among the decommissioned coils and stripped cargo drones and cracked cabling it had once been assembled out of, a piece of evidence sitting quietly among all the other pieces of evidence that broken things were rarely as finished as their paperwork claimed. No one on Kessa Anchor ever again mistook a mismatched, improvised, unglamorous fix for something less than what it was. They had learned, the hard way, that the things built out of what's broken are sometimes the only things strong enough to hold when everything certified fails first.